The woman nobody wanted was about to be sold like cattle, stuffed onto a westbound train by the brother who couldn't stand to look at her anymore. Maeve Holloway had survived mockery, theft, and cruelty, but nothing prepared her for the humiliation of being shipped to a stranger as damaged goods. Her brother lied. The groom expected someone else. The frontier was unforgiving, but sometimes the unwanted become unstoppable. This is the story of a woman who refused to disappear. Stay until the end and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. Hit that like button. Let's begin. The boarding house smelled like boiled cabbage and old regret. Maeve Holloway scrubbed the wooden floors on her hands and knees, her back screaming in protest, her fingers raw from lye soap that had long since eaten through any softness her skin once had. The floorboards creaked under her weight. They always did. And she'd learned years ago to ignore the snickers from the boarders when she passed. Fat Maeve. Poor Maeve. The girl too big for her own good. She was 26 years old and had never been kissed, had never been courted, had never been anything but a punchline whispered behind dirty hands. Maeve! Silas's voice cut through the dim hallway like a blade. She flinched before she could stop herself, then hated herself for flinching. Her brother appeared at the top of the stairs, his face flushed red from whiskey even though it wasn't yet noon. He was thin where she was wide, sharp where she was soft, and he wore his cruelty like a second skin. You done with the floors? Almost. Her voice came out small. She hated that too. Almost ain't done. Mrs. Kern's room needs fresh linens, her chamber pot needs emptying, and the stove's gone cold again. He descended the stairs, each step deliberate. You think I run this place on air? You think your keep comes free? Maeve kept her eyes down. No, Silas. No, Silas, he mimicked, his tone mocking. Get up! You look like a cow on all fours. All. She stood slowly, her knees protesting, and wiped her hands on her already filthy apron. Silas looked her up and down with the expression of a man inspecting spoiled meat. You're an embarrassment, he said flatly. It wasn't the first time he'd said it. It wouldn't be the last. But something about the way he said it today felt different, heavier, final. I work hard, Maeve said quietly. I do everything you ask. You eat more than you're worth. Silas stepped closer, and she could smell the whiskey on his breath. And now you've gone and made yourself a spectacle. Her stomach dropped. What? Don't play dumb. The whole town's talking about what you did to Gerald Finch last night. Maeve's throat tightened. Gerald Finch, the drunk who'd cornered her in the alley behind the boarding house when she'd gone out to dump the wash water. He'd grabbed her arm, leered at her with yellowed teeth, and said things that made her skin crawl. She'd shoved him, hard. He'd fallen into a mud puddle, and she'd run inside and locked the door. He tried to... I don't care what he tried. Silas's eyes were cold. You made a fool of him. And now he's telling everyone in town that you're a violent, ungrateful woman who attacked him for no reason. That's a lie. It's the truth that matters, and the truth is what people believe. Silas crossed his arms. You've made things difficult for me, Maeve. People are asking why I keep you around, why I let you work here when you're clearly unstable. Tears burned behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. I'm not unstable. I was defending myself. You're a burden. Silas's voice dropped to something quieter, something worse than anger. And I'm done carrying you. The words hit like a fist. Maeve stared at him, her pulse pounding in her ears. What does that mean? It means I've found a solution. Silas reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. You're leaving, tomorrow. Leaving? Her voice cracked. Where? West, Montana Territory. A rancher out there is looking for a wife, and I've arranged the match. The floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet. You did what? Don't look at me like that. This is a kindness, Maeve. The man's willing to take you sight unseen. He needs help on his ranch, and you need a roof over your head that isn't mine. Silas unfolded the paper and held it up. Contract's already signed. Train leaves at dawn. Maeve's breath came in short, shallow gasps. You can't do this. You can't just... I can, and I have. Silas shoved the paper at her. You'll go. You'll marry him, and you'll stop being my problem. She took the paper with trembling hands. The words blurred in front of her eyes. Mail order bride. Coulter Boone, Boone Ranch, Montana Territory. Agreement finalized. I don't even know this man, she whispered. You don't need to know him. You need to obey him. That's what wives do. Silas turned toward the stairs, dismissing her like she was nothing. Pack your things. Don't take much. You won't need it. Silas, please. He stopped, glanced back over his shoulder. For a moment, just a moment, she thought she saw something human in his face. But then it was gone. This is mercy, Maeve. The world doesn't want women like you. At least this way, you'll have a purpose. Then he was gone, his boots heavy on the stairs, and Maeve stood alone in the hallway, clutching a piece of paper that had just sold her future to a stranger. She didn't sleep that night. Maeve sat on the edge of her narrow bed in the attic room she'd called home for as long as she could remember, staring at the contract in her lap. The lantern flickered, casting shadows that danced across the slanted ceiling. Women like you. The phrase echoed in her head, a familiar poison she'd swallowed 1,000 times before. Women like you don't get choices. Women like you should be grateful for scraps. Women like you are lucky anyone would take you at all. She thought about running, just walking out the door in the dead of night and disappearing into the streets. But where would she go? She had no money. Silas took every cent she earned, no family besides him, no friends who'd risk their reputations by helping her. The truth settled over her like a heavy coat. She was trapped. At dawn, Silas dragged her trunk downstairs and loaded it onto a wagon without a word. Maeve followed, numb and silent, dressed in the only good dress she owned, a plain brown thing that barely fit anymore. The streets were still dark, the town quiet except for the distant whistle of the train. Silas drove the wagon to the station and didn't look at her once. When they arrived, he handed her a single ticket and a small pouch. There's enough money in there for food on the train. Don't spend it on anything else. Maeve took the pouch. It felt light. Too light. Silas, she said, her voice hoarse, why are you doing this? He finally looked at her, and there was nothing in his eyes. No regret, no guilt, just exhaustion. Because I'm tired, Maeve. I'm tired of looking at you and seeing everything wrong with this family. You're a reminder of every bad thing that ever happened to us, and I can't carry it anymore. He climbed back onto the wagon. Go west. Marry the rancher. Forget you ever had a brother. Then he snapped the reins, and the wagon rolled away. Maeve stood on the platform, alone, clutching her ticket and her small trunk, and watched the only life she'd ever known disappear into the gray morning light. The train was a beast of iron and steam, belching smoke into the cold air. Maeve climbed aboard, her legs shaking, and found a seat near the back. The other passengers barely glanced at her. A blessing, for once. She pressed her forehead against the window and watched the town slide past as the train lurched forward. She was leaving. Leaving the boarding house, the cruelty, the shame. Leaving the only place she'd ever known. And she had no idea what waited for her at the end of the line. Vapas. The journey west was endless. Days blurred together in a haze of rattling wheels and coal smoke. Maeve barely spoke to the other passengers. She kept to herself, nibbling on the hard bread and cheese she'd bought with Silas's meager allowance, staring out the window at landscapes that grew wider and emptier with every passing mile. The cities gave way to farmland. The farmland gave way to plains. The plains gave way to mountains so vast and wild they made her chest ache with something she couldn't name. By the 4th day, she'd stopped crying. By the 5th, she'd stopped feeling anything at all. The train finally screeched to a halt at a tiny station that barely deserved the name. A weathered sign read Cutter's Ridge, and beyond it stretched nothing but open land and sky. End of the line, miss, the conductor said, not unkindly. Maeve stood on shaking legs, grabbed her trunk, and stepped onto the platform. The wind hit her like a slap, cold, relentless, the kind of wind that had nothing to stop it for 100 miles. She pulled her shawl tighter and looked around. A man stood near the edge of the platform, leaning against a wagon. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and still as stone. His hat shadowed his face, but she could see the hard line of his jaw, the way his arms crossed over his chest like he was guarding something. Maeve's heart hammered. That had to be him. Coulter Boone. The man who'd bought her future sight unseen. She forced herself to walk forward, her trunk dragging behind her, her breath coming in short bursts. When she stopped in front of him, the man pushed his hat back and looked at her, and froze. His eyes, gray, sharp, unreadable, swept over her face, her body, her dress. His expression didn't change, but something flickered there. Confusion, surprise, disappointment. "You're Maeve Holloway?" His voice was low, rough, like gravel underfoot. "Yes." Her voice barely worked. "Are you Coulter Boone?" He didn't answer right away. His gaze dropped to the trunk at her feet, then back to her face. "You're not what I was expecting." The words landed like stones. Maeve's stomach twisted. I don't understand." Coulter's jaw tightened. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded photograph, held it up. Maeve's breath caught. The woman in the photograph was beautiful, delicate, small. Everything Maeve wasn't. "This," Coulter said slowly, "is the woman your brother promised me." Maeve stared at the photograph, her mind racing. She'd never seen that picture before. Didn't know who the woman was. Silas had lied. Of course he had. "I didn't know," she whispered. "He didn't tell me." "Doesn't matter what he told you." Coulter shoved the photograph back into his coat, his expression hardening. "The contract's paid. You're here. So what happens now?" Maeve's voice shook despite herself. Coulter looked at her for a long moment, and she couldn't tell what he was thinking. Then he picked up her trunk like it weighed nothing and carried it to the wagon. "Now," he said without looking back, "you get in the wagon." Patits. They rode in silence. The ranch was an hour away and the landscape swallowed them whole. Endless grass. Distant mountains. A sky so big it felt like drowning. Maeve sat stiffly beside Coulter, her hands clenched in her lap. He didn't speak, didn't look at her, just drove the wagon with his eyes fixed on the horizon, his jaw set like granite. She wanted to say something, apologize, explain, but the words stuck in her throat and the silence pressed down like a weight. When the ranch finally came into view, Maeve's breath caught. It wasn't much. A low house, weathered gray by wind and sun. A barn that leaned slightly to one side. Corrals and fences stretching out toward the hills. Everything looked hard-used, practical, built to survive rather than impress. Coulter pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house and climbed down without a word. He grabbed her trunk, carried it inside, and then came back out. "You can stay in the house," he said, his tone flat. "I'll sleep in the barn." Maeve blinked. "What?" "You heard me?" He turned away, heading toward the barn. "Wait." She climbed down from the wagon, her legs unsteady. "I don't understand. You paid for a wife. I'm here. What happens now?" Coulter stopped, turned, looked at her with those unreadable gray eyes. "You stay for a week," he said. "At the end of the week, you decide if you want to stay or leave. If you leave, I'll pay for your ticket wherever you want to go. If you stay," he paused, "we'll figure it out." Maeve stared at him. "You're giving me a choice?" "Everyone deserves a choice." Coulter's voice was quiet, almost bitter. "Even women nobody wanted." The words cut deeper than he probably intended. Before she could respond, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the barn and leaving her standing alone in the wind. That first night, Maeve barely slept. The house was small but clean. One room with a bed, a stove, a table, and a chair. Everything sparse and worn but functional. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the walls, her mind spinning. Coulter's words echoed in her head. "You stay for a week, you decide." No one had ever given her a decision before. Not once in her entire life. Everything had always been decided for her, forced on her, taken from her. And now this stranger, this hard, silent man who'd been lied to just as much as she had, was offering her something she didn't know how to hold. Freedom. The thought terrified her. Morning came too soon. Maeve woke to the sound of animals, cattle lowing in the distance, chickens clucking somewhere nearby. She dressed quickly, splashed cold water on her face from the basin, and stepped outside. The sun was just rising, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. The air was cold and sharp, and the land stretched out forever in every direction. Coulter was already working. She could see him near the barn, feeding the horses, his movements efficient and practiced. He didn't look up when she approached. "Good morning," she said quietly. He glanced at her, nodded once, and went back to his work. Maeve stood there, unsure what to do. Is there something I can help with? Can you cook? Yes. Then make breakfast. I'll be in when I'm done here. It wasn't a request. It wasn't an order either, just a statement of fact. Maeve went back inside, grateful for something to do. She found flour, eggs, a little bacon. The stove was stubborn, but she coaxed it to life and set to work. By the time Coulter came in, the table was set with plates of eggs, bacon, and biscuits that were only slightly burned. He sat down without a word, ate quickly, and stood. Thank you, he said. Then he was gone again. The days fell into a rhythm. Maeve cooked, cleaned, mended clothes that had been ignored for too long. She explored the ranch slowly, carefully, learning its boundaries. The corrals, the barn, the creek that ran along the eastern edge of the property, and the orchard. She found it by accident on the third day, hidden behind a line of cottonwood trees. It was overgrown and wild, the trees gnarled and untended, but she could see the shape of what it once was. Apple trees. Maybe 20 of them. Long abandoned. Something stirred in her chest as she walked among them. She could fix this. That night she asked Coulter about it. The orchard, she said as he ate the stew she'd made. Can I work on it? He looked up, surprised. Why? Because it shouldn't be wasted. Coulter studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. Do what you want with it. Maeve threw herself into the work. She cleared the weeds, pruned the dead branches, hauled water from the creek in heavy buckets that left her arms aching and her back screaming. The trees were stubborn, but she was more stubborn. Coulter watched from a distance. She could feel his eyes on her sometimes when she worked, but he never said anything, never stopped her. On the 5th day, he brought her a pair of gloves. Your hands are bleeding, he said, dropping them on the ground beside her. Maeve looked down. He was right. She hadn't noticed. Thank you, she said. He walked away without responding. The week was almost over. Maeve stood in the orchard on the 6th evening, wiping sweat from her forehead, her hands covered in dirt despite the gloves. The trees were starting to look like something again. Not perfect. Not healed, but alive. She heard footsteps behind her and turned. Coulter stood at the edge of the orchard, his hat in his hands, his expression unreadable. Tomorrow, he said quietly, the week's up. Maeve's heart clenched. I know. You made your decision? She looked at the trees, at the ranch stretching out behind him, at the sky turning purple and gold as the sun set. This place was harsh, silent, unforgiving, but it was the first place she'd ever felt like she could breathe. I want to stay, she said. Coulter's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Relief, maybe, or something close to it. All right then, he said. And for the first time since she'd arrived, Maeve saw the faintest shadow of a smile. But the peace didn't last. 2 days later, a rider came. Maeve was in the kitchen when she heard the horse. She looked out the window and saw a man dismounting near the barn. Tall, thin, dressed in town clothes. Coulter met him outside and their voices carried on the wind. Low, tense. Maeve's stomach tightened. She stepped onto the porch, and Coulter glanced at her, his jaw tight. This is Reverend Alcott, he said flatly. From Cutter's Ridge. The Reverend looked at Maeve, then at Coulter, his expression disapproving. Mr. Boone, I've come on behalf of the community. There's been talk. Talk, Coulter repeated, his voice cold. About the woman living here. Unmarried. Unchaperoned. The Reverend's gaze flicked to Maeve. It's unseemly, Mr. Boone, improper. People are concerned. People should mind their own business. The moral standards of this community are everyone's business. The Reverend straightened. You're a respected man, Mr. Boone. This situation reflects poorly on you and on her. Maeve's face burned. She wanted to disappear, to sink into the ground and never be seen again. But Coulter's voice cut through the shame like a blade. Get off my land. The Reverend blinked. Excuse me? You heard me. Coulter stepped forward, and there was something dangerous in the way he moved. This is my ranch, my business, and you're not welcome here. Mr. Boone, leave, The Reverend's face flushed red. He opened his mouth to argue, then seemed to think better of it. He climbed back onto his horse, shot one last disapproving look at Maeve, and rode away. Coulter stood there, fists clenched, staring after him. Maeve's voice came out small. "I'm sorry." "Don't." Coulter turned to her, his expression hard. "Don't apologize for other people's ugliness." "But he's right. People are talking. It's not proper for me to be here like this." "I don't care what's proper." Coulter's voice was rough. "You're staying because you chose to stay. That's all that matters." Maeve wanted to believe him, but she'd spent her whole life hearing what she was worth, and it was hard to shake. The storm came 3 days later. Maeve woke to thunder so loud it shook the walls. Rain hammered the roof, and the wind howled like something alive. She stumbled out of bed, her heart pounding, and opened the door. Coulter was already outside, running toward the barn. The cattle were loose, panicking, scattering across the field in the chaos. Maeve didn't think. She just ran. The rain hit her like fists, soaking her in seconds. The wind tried to knock her down, but she pushed forward, running toward the herd. Coulter saw her, shouted something she couldn't hear, but she didn't stop. She grabbed a loose rope, chased down a calf that was running blind with fear, and dragged it back toward the corral. The mud sucked at her boots. The rain blurred everything, but she didn't stop. Coulter was everywhere, rounding up the cattle, shouting orders she followed without question. They worked side by side in the storm, fighting the wind and the rain and the fear. And when the last animal was finally back in the corral, they stood there gasping, soaked to the bone, covered in mud. Coulter looked at her, and for the first time Maeve saw something in his eyes that wasn't caution or distance. It was respect. "You didn't have to do that," he said, his voice rough. "Yes," Maeve said, breathless. "I did." The rain poured down around them, and neither moved. Then Coulter turned and walked back toward the house, and Maeve followed, something in her chest cracking open. The next morning, Silas arrived. Maeve was hanging laundry when she heard the wagon. She turned, and her blood went cold. Silas climbed down, his face twisted in fury. And beside him was Gerald Finch, the man from the alley, the man she'd shoved into the mud. Coulter stepped out of the barn, his eyes narrowing. "What do you want?" he said. "I want my sister." Silas's voice was sharp. "She's coming back with me." Maeve's heart stopped. "No," she whispered. Silas ignored her, pulling a folded paper from his coat. "I'm her legal guardian. This contract your brother signed doesn't mean a damn thing. She's leaving." "No." Maeve's voice was louder now. "I'm not going anywhere." "You don't have a choice, Maeve." Silas's eyes were cold. "You never did." Coulter stepped forward, his body a wall between Maeve and her brother. "She's staying. She's coming with me." Silas's hand dropped to the pistol at his belt. "And if you try to stop me, we'll have a problem." The air crackled with tension, and then Coulter said the words that changed everything. "She's my wife." Silence. Silas stared. Gerald stared. Maeve's breath caught in her throat. "You're lying," Silas said. "Am I?" Coulter's voice was calm, cold. "We were married 2 days after she arrived, legal and binding. She's not yours anymore." Silas's face went red. "You're lying." "Prove it." Coulter crossed his arms. "Go ahead. Ride into town. Ask the Reverend. He'll tell you the same thing." Maeve's mind spun. It was a lie. A bold, reckless lie. But Silas didn't know that. Gerald leaned close to Silas, muttering something low. Silas's jaw worked, fury radiating off him in waves. But finally, he climbed back onto the wagon. "This isn't over," he spat. Then they were gone, disappearing down the road in a cloud of dust. Maeve stood frozen, her heart hammering. Coulter turned to her, his expression unreadable. "We need to talk," he said. The house felt smaller with both of them inside it. Maeve stood near the stove, her hand still shaking from the confrontation, watching as Coulter paced the narrow space between the table and the door. His boots left mud prints on the floor she'd scrubbed that morning, but neither of them cared. "That was reckless," she finally said. Coulter stopped pacing. "It worked. It was a lie. It was necessary." He pulled off his hat, ran a hand through his dark hair. "Your brother wasn't going to leave without you, and that bastard with him, Finch. He was looking for an excuse to drag you back. Maeve's stomach turned at the memory of Gerald's face, the way he'd looked at her like she was something he could still claim. Silas had papers, legal guardianship. Papers don't mean anything if you're married. Coulter's voice was flat, matter of fact. A husband's claim supersedes a brother's. That's the law. But we're not married. They don't know that. Maeve wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the warmth from the stove. What happens when they find out? When they ask the Reverend and he tells them the truth? Coulter was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned to face her fully, his gray eyes steady. Then we make it the truth. The words hung in the air between them. Maeve's breath caught. What? We get married? For real? Coulter's tone didn't change, like he was discussing the weather or the price of cattle. It's the only way to keep you safe from your brother's claim. You can't be serious. I'm always serious. He crossed his arms. You want to go back with him? Back to that life? No. The word came out sharp, immediate. Then this is the answer. Maeve stared at him, her mind racing. Marriage, a real marriage. To this man she'd known for barely 2 weeks. This hard, silent stranger who'd given her a choice when no one else ever had. Why would you do this? She asked quietly. You don't even know me. You didn't want me in the first place. Something flickered across Coulter's face. Regret, maybe, or shame. I was wrong about that. Wrong how? I expected someone else. Someone... He paused, searching for words. Someone I could control. Someone small and quiet and grateful. Someone who'd do what she was told and never cause trouble. I'm not any of those things. No. Coulter's mouth quirked, almost a smile. You're not. You're stubborn, and you work too hard, and you don't know when to quit. He gestured toward the window, toward the orchard beyond. You've done more with those trees in a week than I've done with this whole ranch in a year. You ran into a storm to save cattle that weren't even yours. He stopped himself. I'm what? Maeve's voice was barely a whisper. You're stronger than you think you are, Coulter said. And I was a fool for not seeing it sooner. The words settled over her like something physical. No one had ever called her strong before. No one had ever looked at her the way Coulter was looking at her now, like she was something worth keeping. But marriage, real marriage, that meant forever. That meant sharing a life, a bed, a future with this man who was still mostly a stranger. If we do this, Maeve said slowly, what would it mean? What would you expect from me? Coulter's expression hardened slightly. I'd expect you to work, same as you've been doing. Help around the ranch, cook, mend, whatever needs doing. And at night? His jaw tightened. You'd have the house. I'd stay in the barn. Maeve blinked. What? I'm not asking you to share my bed, Maeve, like... Coulter's voice was rough. This would be a marriage of convenience, protection, nothing more. Something twisted in her chest. Relief maybe, but also something else. Something that felt uncomfortably like disappointment. You don't want a real wife. I want you safe, that's all. Maeve looked down at her hands, at the calluses forming on her palms from work she'd chosen to do. She thought about Silas's cold eyes, Gerald's leering face, the life she'd left behind, the mockery, the shame, the endless weight of being unwanted. And then she thought about the orchard, the way the trees were starting to bloom under her care, the way the land felt beneath her feet when she walked it at dawn, the way Coulter had stood between her and her brother like a wall nothing could break through. All right, she said. Coulter's eyes widened slightly. All right? I'll marry you. Maeve lifted her chin, but on one condition. What's that? I keep working the orchard. It's mine. You don't touch it. For the first time since she'd met him, Coulter smiled. A real smile, small but genuine. Deal. They rode into Cutter's Ridge the next morning. The town was small and dusty, a handful of buildings clustered around a main street that turned to mud when it rained. The general store, a saloon, a boarding house that made Maeve think of Silas and made her stomach turn. And at the far end, a small church with a white steeple that needed paint. Coulter tied the horses outside and helped Maeve down from the wagon. She'd worn her best dress again, the same brown one she'd arrived in, and felt painfully aware of how she looked. Too big. Too plain. Too much. You sure about this? Coulter asked quietly. Maeve nodded, not trusting her voice. They walked up the steps together, and Coulter knocked. Reverend Alcott opened the door, his expression souring the moment he saw them. Mr. Boone, I thought I made myself clear. We're here to get married, Coulter interrupted. The Reverend blinked. Excuse me? You heard me? We want to make it legal, today. Alcott's gaze flicked to Maeve, then back to Coulter. This is rather sudden. It's necessary. Coulter's tone left no room for argument. Can you do it or not? The Reverend's mouth pressed into a thin line. He clearly wanted to refuse, but refusing to marry a couple was bad for business, and everyone knew it. I'll need witnesses. Then find some. 20 minutes later, Maeve stood in the small church beside Coulter Boone, her hands cold despite the warmth of the day. Two women from the boarding house, strangers Alcott had recruited with the promise of gossip, stood as witnesses, whispering behind their hands. The ceremony was brief, mechanical. Alcott read from a worn prayer book, his voice flat and disapproving. Coulter's responses were steady, certain. Maeve's voice shook. Do you, Maeve Holloway, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? She looked at Coulter. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were steady on hers. I do, she whispered. Then by the power vested in me, I pronounce you man and wife. No kiss, no celebration, just a signature in a dusty ledger and a piece of paper that made the lie into truth. They walked out of the church as husband and wife, and Maeve felt like she was living in someone else's life. We need to file the certificate at the county office, Coulter said as they climbed back into the wagon. Make sure it's official, in case your brother tries anything. Maeve nodded numbly. They rode in silence to a squat building at the edge of town where a bored clerk stamped their marriage certificate and filed it away without a second glance. Just like that, it was done. Legal, binding. Maeve Boone. The name felt strange in her mouth. On the ride back to the ranch, Coulter finally spoke. You all right? I don't know, Maeve admitted. Regret it already? No, it's just... She struggled to find the words. It doesn't feel real. It's real. Coulter's hands tightened on the reins. You're safe now. That's what matters. Safe. The word should have been comforting, but Maeve couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just traded one cage for another, even if this cage had open doors. That night, true to his word, Coulter took his bedroll and disappeared into the barn. Maeve stood in the doorway of the house, her house now, legally, and watched him go. The sky was turning purple, stars beginning to appear, and the wind carried the smell of grass and distant rain. She was married to a man who didn't want her, to a man who'd married her out of duty, not desire. The thought shouldn't have hurt. This was a practical arrangement, a solution to a problem. She should be grateful. But standing there alone, watching Coulter's shadow disappear into the barn, Maeve felt the old familiar ache settle back into her chest, the one that whispered she'd never be enough, never be wanted, never be anything but a burden someone had agreed to carry. She went inside and closed the door. The days that followed were strange. Nothing changed, and everything changed. Maeve still cooked breakfast every morning, still cleaned and mended and worked the orchard. Coulter still rose before dawn, worked until dark, and spoke only when necessary. They moved around each other like dancers who'd practiced the steps but never touched. But now there was a weight to the silence, an awareness that hadn't been there before. She was his wife. He was her husband, and neither of them knew what to do with that. On the third day after the wedding, Maeve was in the orchard when she heard voices. She looked up to see 3 women approaching, town women, dressed in clean skirts and bonnets, carrying baskets. Her stomach sank. Mrs. Boone, one of them called, her voice bright and false. We heard the news and thought we'd pay a visit. Maeve set down her pruning shears and walked toward them, wiping her dirty hands on her apron. That's kind of you. The woman in front, middle-aged, with sharp eyes and a sharper smile, extended a basket. I'm Mrs. Fletcher. This is Mrs. Kern and Mrs. Paulson. We brought some preserves to welcome you properly. Thank you. Maeve took the basket, feeling like she was holding a snake. Mrs. Fletcher's gaze swept over the orchard, the half-pruned trees, the piles of cleared brush. My, you've been busy. The orchard needed work. I can see that. Mrs. Kern stepped closer, her expression curious. We didn't realize Mr. Boone had sent for a bride. He's always been so private. It was arranged quickly, Maeve said carefully. Clearly, Mrs. Paulson's smile didn't reach her eyes. The Reverend mentioned you married rather suddenly, after some unfortunate talk. There it was, the real reason for the visit. Maeve lifted her chin. My husband and I saw no reason to wait. Of course not. Mrs. Fletcher's tone was honey over poison. Though it is unusual for a man to marry a woman he's never met. Sight unseen, as they say. He'd seen my photograph. Had he? Mrs. Kern tilted her head. How romantic. The words were polite, but the subtext was clear. They didn't believe it. Didn't believe Coulter would choose someone like her. Didn't believe any man would. Maeve felt the old shame rising, hot and familiar. If you'll excuse me, I have work to finish. Of course, dear. Mrs. Fletcher's smile widened. We'll leave you to it. But do come to church on Sunday. It's important for a new bride to be seen with her husband. Establishes things, you know. The women left in a rustle of skirts and whispered gossip, and Maeve stood there holding the basket of preserves like it might explode. That evening, she told Coulter about the visit. He was repairing a fence post near the barn, his shirt sleeves rolled up, sweat darkening the fabric across his shoulders. He didn't look up when she approached. We have visitors today, Maeve said. I saw. Coulter drove the post deeper into the ground. What did they want? To snoop, to judge, to make sure I know I don't belong here. That got his attention. He straightened, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. What did they say? Nothing directly, just... Maeve struggled to explain. They didn't have to say it. I could see it in their faces. They think you made a mistake marrying me. I don't care what they think. Well, I do. The words came out sharper than she intended. They invited us to church on Sunday, said it's important for us to be seen together. Coulter's jaw tightened. You want to go? No, but if we don't, it'll make things worse. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Fine. We'll go. Sunday morning arrived cold and gray. Maeve dressed in her brown dress again, the only decent thing she owned, and tried to tame her hair into something presentable. Her hands shook as she pinned it back. She hated this. Hated the scrutiny, the judgment, the feeling of being on display. Coulter emerged from the barn wearing a clean shirt and his good hat, his face freshly shaved. He looked uncomfortable, like the clothes didn't fit right, but he said nothing as he helped her into the wagon. The ride to town was silent. The church was already full when they arrived. Every head turned as they walked in, and Maeve felt the weight of 100 eyes on her back. She kept her gaze down, following Coulter to a pew near the back. The service was endless. Reverend Alcott droned on about sin and righteousness and the sanctity of marriage, his eyes lingering on Maeve more than once. She sat rigid, her hands clenched in her lap, feeling like an insect pinned to a board. Coulter sat beside her, still as stone, but she could feel the tension radiating off him. When the service finally ended, people swarmed. The women clustered around Maeve with false smiles and invasive questions. The men clapped Coulter on the back and made jokes that weren't quite jokes. Quite the surprise, Boone, one man said, grinning. Didn't know you had it in you. She's a sturdy one, another added, his gaze sliding over Maeve in a way that made her skin crawl. Good for farm work, I'd wager. Coulter's expression went cold. We're leaving. He took Maeve's arm and steered her toward the door, ignoring the protests and the laughter that followed them outside. They climbed into the wagon, and Coulter snapped the reins harder than necessary. I'm sorry, Maeve said quietly as they left town behind. For what? For making you go through that. You didn't make me do anything. Coulter's voice was tight. Those people are vultures. They feed on other people's misery. They think you made a mistake. They can think whatever they want. He glanced at her, his expression hard. I don't regret marrying you, Maeve, and I don't give a damn what they say. The words should have been comforting, but Maeve heard what he didn't say. He didn't regret marrying her because it was practical, necessary, not because he wanted her. The distinction cut deeper than she wanted to admit. Spring arrived slowly, stubbornly, dragging warmth behind it like a reluctant promise. The orchard began to bloom. Small white flowers appeared on the apple trees, delicate and unexpected, and Maeve spent hours among them, marveling at what she'd coaxed back to life. The trees weren't perfect. Some were scarred, some grew crooked, but they were alive, growing, becoming something. She understood that feeling. Life on the ranch settled into a rhythm that was almost comfortable. Maeve worked the orchard and the house. Coulter worked the cattle and the land. They ate meals together in near silence, passed each other in the yard with polite nods, existed in separate orbits that occasionally brushed against each other but never quite touched. At night, Maeve lay alone in the bed that was supposed to be theirs, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind. And somewhere across the yard, Coulter lay alone in the barn, and she wondered if he ever thought about the strangeness of it. Husband and wife, separated by walls and promises neither knew how to break. One afternoon in early April, Maeve was carrying water to the orchard when she heard children's voices. She looked up to see 3 kids running across the field, 2 boys and a girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, chasing each other in some game only they understood. They stopped when they saw her, suddenly shy. "Hello," Maeve said. The girl stepped forward, braver than the boys. "Are you Mrs. Boone?" "I am." "Our ma says you're new, that you came from back east." "That's right." "She says you're—" The girl stopped herself, her face flushing. Maeve could guess what her mother had said. "What's your name?" "Lily. These are my brothers, Tom and James. We live at the Fletcher place, just over the ridge." Fletcher. Mrs. Fletcher's children, the woman who'd brought poisoned preserves and fake smiles. "What are you doing all the way out here?" Maeve asked. "Exploring," Tom said. "We're not supposed to, but Ma's busy with the washing." "Well, you'd better get back before she notices you're gone." The children started to leave, but Lily hesitated. "Is it true you have an orchard?" "I do." "Can we see it?" Maeve should have said no, should have sent them home. But something in Lily's eager face made her soften. "All right, but just for a minute." She led them through the trees, watching as their eyes went wide at the blossoms. Tom climbed one immediately, earning a scolded warning from his sister. James picked a flower and tucked it behind Lily's ear. "It's like a fairy tale," Lily breathed. Maeve smiled despite herself. "It's just trees." "No, it's magic." They stayed longer than a minute. Maeve let them climb and play, and for a little while she forgot about the weight she carried, forgot about the town's judgment and the distance between her and Coulter, and the constant ache of feeling like she didn't belong. When the children finally left, racing back toward home before they were missed, Maeve stood alone in the orchard and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Happy. Coulter found her there at dusk, sitting beneath one of the trees, her back against the trunk. "You all right?" he asked. "Yeah, just thinking." He hesitated, then sat down beside her. Not close, but not far either. "About what?" "About how strange life is. How quickly things can change." She looked at the blossoms above them. 3 months ago, I was scrubbing floors in a boarding house, believing I'd die there. Now I'm here, married, working land I never imagined I'd see. It doesn't feel real sometimes. Coulter was quiet for a long moment. "Does it feel wrong?" "No." Maeve turned to look at him. "Does it for you?" "No." They sat there in this gathering darkness, surrounded by blooming trees and the sound of distant cattle. And for the first time, Maeve thought maybe this strange arrangement might actually become something she could live with, maybe even something she could want. But wanting was dangerous. Wanting led to disappointment. And Maeve had learned a long time ago that women like her didn't get the things they wanted. So she kept the feeling locked away, buried deep, and told herself it was enough just to be here. Safe. Free. Even if she was still alone. The weeks blurred together after that evening under the apple trees, each day folding into the next like pages in a book Maeve was learning to read. The orchard continued its slow resurrection, and with it, something in Maeve began to unfurl, cautious and fragile, but undeniably there. She caught herself humming sometimes while she worked, singing, even, when she thought no one could hear. Old songs her mother had taught her before the world turned cruel. The sound of her own voice startled her the first time, as if it belonged to someone else entirely. Coulter noticed. She could tell by the way he paused sometimes when he passed the orchard, his steps faltering just slightly before he continued on. But he never said anything, never interrupted, Just let her have that small piece of joy without comment or judgment. It was the not judging that undid her bit by bit. One morning in late April, Maeve woke to find a package on the kitchen table. Brown paper, tied with string, no note. She unwrapped it slowly, her heart hammering for reasons she couldn't name. Inside were 3 dresses. Simple, practical things in dark blue and gray and green, nothing fancy but new, clean, made for someone her size. She stood there holding them, her throat tight, and when Coulter came in for breakfast, she couldn't look at him. "They're from the seamstress in town," he said quietly. "Mrs. Chen, I gave her your measurements." "How did you—" "I guessed." He poured himself coffee, his back to her. "If they don't fit, she'll adjust them." "Coulter," Maeve's voice cracked. "You didn't have to—" "You needed them." He sat down at the table, his tone matter-of-fact. "That brown dress is falling apart, and you worked too hard to have only one thing to wear." She wanted to argue, to tell him she didn't deserve new things, that he'd already done too much. But the words stuck in her throat, replaced by something far more dangerous. Gratitude. And beneath it, warming like coals, something that felt uncomfortably like affection. "Thank you," she whispered. Coulter nodded once and started eating his eggs like nothing had happened. But everything had happened. Everything was happening. And Maeve was terrified by how much she wanted it to continue. The children came back the following week. Maeve was pruning the lower branches of an apple tree when she heard giggling. She looked down to find Lily peeking around the trunk, her brothers hovering behind her. "We brought you something," Lily announced, producing a small basket. "Ma made extra biscuits, and we thought maybe you'd want some." Maeve climbed down carefully, wiping her hands on her apron. "Does your mother know you're here?" "We told her we were going to pick wildflowers." Tom grinned, unrepentant. "We'll get some on the way back." "That's called lying." "It's called being clever," James countered. Despite herself, Maeve laughed. "Get over here. If you're going to be outlaws, at least help me with these branches." They worked together for an hour, the children chattering endlessly about school and their neighbors, and the horse one of them wanted but would never get. Maeve let them climb the trees, watched them swing from branches that held their weight easily, and something in her chest ached with a sweetness she didn't know how to name. When they finally left, flower-dusted and grass-stained and completely happy, Coulter was standing near the barn, watching. "You're good with them," he said when she walked over. "They're easy to be good with." "Not for everyone." Coulter's gaze lingered on her face. "You ever think about having your own?" The question hit like a fist. Maeve looked away quickly, her face burning. "That's not something I need to think about." "Why not?" "Because we're not—" She stopped, the words tangling. "This isn't that kind of marriage." "I know what kind of marriage this is." Coulter's voice was quiet. "I'm just asking if you ever wanted it. Kids? A family." Maeve's hands clenched at her sides. "It doesn't matter what I want. I've never been the kind of woman men want that with." "That's not true." "Isn't it?" She finally looked at him, and all the old hurt came spilling out. "You married me because you had to, because my brother forced your hand and you were trying to be decent. Don't pretend it was anything else." Coulter's jaw tightened. "You think that's the only reason?" "What other reason would there be?" He stared at her for a long moment, something working behind his eyes. Anger or frustration or something she couldn't identify. Then he turned and walked away without answering. Maeve stood there alone, her heart pounding, wondering why she felt like she'd just lost something she never had in the first place. That night, Coulter didn't come to the house for dinner. Maeve set the table for 2 anyway, then sat there as the food grew cold, feeling like a fool. She should have kept her mouth shut, should have let the moment pass instead of dragging all her ugliness into the light. But she'd never been good at pretending things didn't hurt. She was washing the dishes when she heard the barn door slam. She looked out the window and saw Coulter striding toward the house, his expression dark. Her stomach dropped. The door banged open. "You want to know the truth?" Coulter demanded. Maeve turned, water dripping from her hands. "What?" "You asked what other reason there would be. You want to know?" "Coulter, I married you because I wanted to." The words came out harsh, like they'd been dragged from somewhere deep. "Not because your brother showed up, not because it was convenient, because I wanted you to stay." Maeve's breath caught. "You're lying." "I don't lie." Then you're confused. You felt sorry for me. I felt a lot of things. Coulter stepped closer, and there was something raw in his eyes. But pity wasn't one of them. You think I didn't see what you were doing? The way you took something broken and made it live again? The way you worked until your hands bled? The way you stood up to those women in town even though they made you feel like dirt? Stop. You're the strongest person I've ever met, Maeve, and the most stubborn. And I married you because I couldn't stand the thought of you leaving. His voice dropped. So don't tell me it was just duty. Don't tell me I didn't want this. The room felt too small, too warm. Maeve's heart hammered against her ribs like something trying to escape. You don't mean that, she whispered. I've never meant anything more. They stood there, 3 feet apart, the distance between them crackling with everything unsaid. Maeve wanted to move, to step forward or backward, anything to break the terrible tension, but she was frozen, caught between disbelief and something far more terrifying. Hope. I don't know what you want from me, she said finally. I don't want anything from you. Coulter's voice was rough. I just want you to stop pretending you're not worth wanting. Then he turned and left, the door closing quietly behind him, and Maeve sank into the chair with her hands shaking and her whole world tilted sideways. She didn't sleep that night, just lay in the dark, replaying the conversation over and over, trying to make sense of it, trying to believe it. Coulter had said he wanted her, not needed, not tolerated, wanted. The word felt foreign, dangerous, like something she couldn't trust because trusting it meant risking everything. But morning came anyway, indifferent to her turmoil, and Maeve dragged herself out of bed and made breakfast because that's what she always did. Because work was easier than thinking. Coulter came in at dawn, same as always. Sat down at the table, same as always. But when their eyes met, something had shifted. A wall had cracked, and neither of them knew how to repair it. About last night, Maeve started. Forget it. Coulter's voice was flat. I shouldn't have said anything. But you did, and now I'm taking it back. He stood abruptly. I've got fences to check. I'll be gone most of the day. He left before she could respond, and Maeve sat there feeling like she'd just been gutted. The days that followed were worse than the silence before. Now there was tension humming beneath every interaction, every glance, every accidental brush of hands when passing plates or tools. Coulter buried himself in work, staying out until dark, coming in only to eat and sleep. Maeve threw herself into the orchard with renewed fury, pruning and digging and hauling until her body screamed. Neither of them talked about what he'd said. Neither of them talked about anything that mattered. And the space between them grew wider even as the wanting grew stronger. It was the middle of May when disaster found them again. Maeve was in the orchard checking the progress of the young fruit beginning to form when she heard hoofbeats. Multiple horses, moving fast. She straightened, shading her eyes against the sun, and her blood turned to ice. 6 riders were approaching the ranch, and leading them was Silas. She ran toward the house, her heart in her throat. Coulter! He emerged from the barn, saw the riders, and his whole body went rigid. Get inside. No. Maeve, I'm not hiding. Coulter's jaw worked, but there was no time to argue. The riders were already pulling up in the yard, dust swirling around the horses' hooves. Silas dismounted first, his face twisted with satisfaction. Beside him, Gerald Finch climbed down, along with 4 other men Maeve didn't recognize. Hard-faced, armed, the kind of men who got paid to do things decent people wouldn't. Well, well, Silas's voice was poison sweet. Thought you could hide behind a fake marriage, did you? Coulter stepped forward, putting himself between Maeve and the men. The marriage is legal, recorded at the county office. You have no claim on her. That's where you're wrong. Silas pulled a folded paper from his coat, waving it like a flag. I did some digging. Turns out that reverend you used, he doesn't have proper authority in this county. His license expired 2 years ago and he never renewed it, which means your marriage isn't worth the paper it's written on. The words hit like bullets. Maeve felt the ground drop out from under her. That's not possible. It's very possible. Silas smiled, and it was the cruelest thing she'd ever seen. You're not married, Maeve. You never were. Which means you're still under my guardianship, and I'm taking you back where you belong. The hell you are. Coulter's voice was low and deadly. You going to stop us, Boone? You and what army? Silas gestured to the men behind him. I brought friends this time, friends who know how to handle men who kidnap women and pretend it's legal. I didn't kidnap anyone. That's not what the law will say. Gerald Finch stepped forward, his smile oily. See, I'm willing to testify that you forced her to stay here against her will, that you threatened her, coerced her, did things a man shouldn't do to a decent woman. That's a lie, Maeve's voice cracked. He never touched me. Your word against ours. Silas's eyes glittered. And we've got 6 witnesses who'll swear to whatever I tell them to swear to. You're coming home, Maeve, today. No. The word came out stronger than Maeve felt. I'm not going anywhere with you. You don't have a choice. I do. I always have a choice. Maeve stepped forward, out from behind Coulter, her whole body shaking but her voice steady. You don't own me, Silas. You never did. And I'm not leaving this ranch. Then we'll drag you off it. Silas nodded to the men, and they moved forward. Coulter's hand dropped to the gun at his hip. Touch her and die. The yard went silent. The men stopped, hands hovering near their own weapons, measuring the odds. Coulter stood like a mountain, immovable, his eyes promising violence. This is foolish, Boone, Silas said, but his voice wavered slightly. You're outnumbered. You can't win. Maybe not. Coulter's voice was ice. But I'll take at least 3 of you with me. You willing to bet you're not one of them? The standoff stretched, tension coiling tighter with each passing second. Maeve's heart hammered so hard she thought it might break through her chest. She wanted to scream, to fight, to do something, but she was frozen by the terrible certainty that someone was about to die. Then a new voice cut through the silence. What in the hell is going on here? Everyone turned. A man on horseback rode into the yard, older, silver-haired, wearing a star pinned to his vest. The sheriff. Behind him rode 2 deputies, both armed, both looking less than pleased at the scene they'd stumbled into. Sheriff Garrett. Silas's smile returned, slick and false. Perfect timing. We were just explaining to Mr. Boone here that he's been illegally harboring my sister.
Save
it, Holloway. Garrett dismounted, his eyes sweeping over the assembled men with clear distaste. I got a wire this morning from the county clerk. Said there might be trouble out at the Boone Ranch. Looks like he was right. Then you can help us. I can help you get off this property before someone gets shot. Garrett's tone was flat. I've seen your paperwork, Holloway, and I've seen the marriage certificate filed with the county. Far as I'm concerned, Mrs. Boone is right where she belongs. But the Reverend's license was renewed 3 weeks ago after the county board reviewed his credentials, which you'd know if you'd bothered to check recent filings instead of relying on outdated information. Garrett crossed his arms. Your sister's marriage is legal. Your claim is void. And if you don't get back on those horses and ride out of here in the next 2 minutes, I'll arrest every last one of you for trespassing and attempted kidnapping. Silas's face went purple. This is ridiculous. She's my sister. She's a married woman, and married women don't need their brother's permission for anything. Garrett's hand rested on his own gun. Clock's ticking, gentlemen. For a moment, Maeve thought Silas might actually try it, might actually order his men to fight. But even he wasn't that stupid, not with the law standing right there. This isn't over, Silas spat, glaring at Maeve with pure hatred. You think you're free? You think this changes anything? You're still the same worthless... Time's up. Garrett drew his gun and the deputies followed suit. Leave, now. Silas climbed back onto his horse, his movements jerky with rage. Gerald and the other men mounted up, and together they rode out in a cloud of dust and fury, Silas shooting one last venomous look over his shoulder. When they were finally gone, the silence felt like a physical thing. Sheriff Garrett holstered his gun and turned to Coulter. You all right, Boone? Yeah. Thanks for the timing. Thank the clerk. He's the one who flagged the situation when Holloway started poking around. Garrett glanced at Maeve, his expression softer. You all right, ma'am? Maeve nodded, not trusting her voice. Good, because if your brother shows up again, I'll lock him up myself. Garrett tipped his hat. You folks take care now. He and the deputies rode out, leaving Maeve and Coulter alone in the yard. The adrenaline drained out of Maeve all at once, and her legs gave out. She sank to the ground, her whole body shaking, and covered her face with her hands. Maeve. Coulter was beside her in an instant, his hands hovering like he wanted to touch her but didn't know if he should. It's over. He's gone. He'll come back. Her voice was muffled. He won't give up. He hates me too much. Let him come. I'll be ready. You can't fight my whole family forever, Coulter. Watch me. She looked up at him, and the fierce determination in his face made her chest ache. Why? Why do you keep doing this? You could have let them take me, could have been rid of the problem. You're not a problem. Coulter's voice was rough. And I told you before, I don't want you gone. But the marriage, what if it really isn't legal? What if... It's legal. The sheriff confirmed it. Coulter reached out, hesitated, then gently brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. You're mine, Maeve. Legally, officially, and I'm not letting anyone take you. The touch sent electricity through her. His hand lingered on her face, warm and calloused and solid, and Maeve couldn't breathe. Yours, she repeated softly. Yeah. His eyes searched hers. If you'll have me. And there it was. The question beneath the question. The choice beneath the choice. Maeve thought about the orchard, the dresses, the way he'd stood between her and danger without hesitation, the way he'd looked at her in the kitchen weeks ago and told her she was strong, the way he'd given her freedom and safety and something that felt dangerously like home. I already have you, she whispered. I've had you since the moment you gave me a choice. Something broke in Coulter's expression. Relief and want and fear all tangled together. He pulled her to her feet, and for a heartbeat they stood there in the dust and the fading light, close enough to touch, but not quite touching. I'm not good at this, he said roughly, at saying things, at knowing what to do. Neither am I. But I want to try, if you do. Maeve looked at this man who'd saved her without knowing it, who'd married her to keep her safe, who'd stood against her brother and the world and given her space to become someone she didn't recognize, someone stronger, someone free. I want to try, she said. And when Coulter pulled her into his arms, really pulled her in, held her tight against his chest like she was something precious, Maeve finally let herself believe she might actually be wanted after all. They stood there in the yard until the sun started to set, Coulter's arms around her, Maeve's face pressed against his chest where she could hear the steady thump of his heart. Neither of them spoke. Words felt too small for what had just happened, for what was still happening between them. When they finally pulled apart, the air between them felt different, charged, like something had fundamentally shifted and there was no going back to what they'd been before. You should come inside, Maeve said quietly. It's getting cold. Coulter nodded but didn't move. His eyes searched her face like he was looking for something, and Maeve had the sudden terrifying realization that he was waiting for her to change her mind, to take back what she'd said, to rebuild the walls they'd just torn down. I meant it, she said. What I said, about wanting to try. I know. His voice was rough. I'm just trying to figure out how. How to what? How to do this without scaring you off. The honesty of it made her chest ache. You won't scare me off, Coulter. I'm tougher than I look. I know you are. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the gesture so gentle it made her throat tight. That's not what I'm worried about. Then what? I'm worried I won't be enough. The words came out low, almost ashamed. That you'll wake up one day and realize you deserved better than some broken-down rancher who doesn't know how to talk to people. Maeve stared at him, seeing for the first time the fear beneath the stoic exterior. He was just as terrified as she was, just as uncertain. You gave me a choice when no one else would, she said softly. You stood between me and the worst parts of my past and didn't flinch. You're already more than enough. Something flickered in Coulter's eyes, gratitude maybe, or relief, and he pulled her close again, burying his face in her hair. I don't know how to do this, he admitted, but I want to learn. Then we'll learn together. That night, for the first time since they'd married, Coulter didn't go to the barn. He stood in the doorway of the house, hesitant, like he was trespassing in his own home. Maeve watched him from the kitchen, drying the dinner dishes, her heart hammering against her ribs. You can sit down, she said. You don't have to hover. Coulter moved to the table, pulled out a chair, but didn't sit. Where do you want me to sleep? The question hung in the air, loaded with everything they weren't saying. Maeve set down the dish towel, her hands trembling slightly. Where do you want to sleep? I don't want to assume. Coulter. She turned to face him fully. We're married. Really married now. Not just on paper. You don't have to keep punishing yourself by sleeping in the barn. I wasn't punishing myself. I was giving you space. I know, and I'm grateful, but she took a breath, forcing the words out. I don't want space anymore. The silence stretched between them, taut as a wire. You sure? Coulter's voice was careful. No. Maeve's laugh came out shaky. I'm terrified, but I'm sure I want to try. Coulter crossed the room in 3 strides and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing her cheeks. We go slow, he said, as slow as you need. Maeve nodded, not trusting her voice. And if you change your mind, if anything feels wrong, you tell me, immediately. I will. He kissed her forehead then, soft and careful, and Maeve closed her eyes against the sudden sting of tears. No one had ever treated her like something fragile before, something worth protecting. That night they lay in the bed together for the first time, a careful distance between them, both rigid with awareness. Maeve stared at the ceiling, listening to Coulter's breathing, feeling the warmth of him beside her, and wondered if this was how it felt to come home. She didn't sleep much. Neither did he. But when dawn broke and she rolled over to find him watching her, something in her chest settled. Morning, she whispered. Morning. His voice was rough with sleep. You all right? Yeah, you? Yeah. They lay there for a moment longer, the morning light painting patterns on the walls. And then Coulter reached out and took her hand. Just held it, nothing more. It was enough. The days that followed were awkward and tender and strange. They were learning each other in ways they hadn't before, small intimacies that felt monumental. The way Coulter took his coffee, the way Maeve hummed while she worked, the way they moved around each other in the small space of the house, no longer careful to avoid touching. Coulter started staying for dinner, started lingering after meals to help clean up, started telling her about his day, the calf that had been born, the fence that needed mending, the conversation he'd had with a neighboring rancher about cattle prices. Small things, normal things, the kind of things husbands and wives talked about. Maeve found herself telling him things too, about the orchard, about the children who kept sneaking over to visit, about the book she'd found in a trunk and was slowly reading by lamplight. They were building something, brick by brick, word by word. It wasn't perfect. It was clumsy and uncertain and sometimes painfully quiet. But it was theirs. One evening in early June, Maeve was sitting on the porch steps watching the sunset when Coulter came and sat beside her. He didn't say anything, just sat close enough that their shoulders touched. Can I ask you something? Maeve said after a while. Always. Why didn't you ever marry before? Before me, I mean. Coulter was quiet for a long moment. Tried once. Long time ago. Maeve turned to look at him. What happened? She left. His voice was flat. Said ranch life wasn't what she expected. Said I wasn't what she expected. Went back east and married a banker. I'm sorry. Don't be. She was right. This life isn't easy, and I'm not... He trailed off, searching for words. I'm not good at the things women want. The talking and the romance and all that. You're doing fine with me. That's different. How? Coulter looked at her, and there was something raw in his eyes. Because you don't expect me to be something I'm not. You just let me be. Maeve's throat tightened. You do the same for me. Yeah. He reached over and laced his fingers through hers. I guess we're both lucky that way. They sat there as the sky turned purple and gold, holding hands like teenagers, and Maeve thought about all the versions of herself she'd been. The girl scrubbing floors in a boarding house, the woman shipped west like cargo, the stranger who'd arrived at this ranch expecting nothing and receiving everything. She was still becoming, still learning, still figuring out who she was beneath all the years of being told what she wasn't. But she was doing it here, with him. And that made all the difference. The peace lasted exactly 13 days. Maeve was in the orchard, checking the young apples that were starting to swell on the branches, when she heard a scream. She dropped the basket she was holding and ran toward the sound, her heart in her throat. As she rounded the barn, she saw them, Lily and her brothers, standing frozen near the creek. And in the water, thrashing and panicking, was a fourth child, A little boy Maeve didn't recognize, maybe 5 years old, caught in the current where the creek ran fast and deep. "Help him!" Lily screamed. "He can't swim!" Maeve didn't think. She just ran. She hit the water at full speed, the cold shocking the breath from her lungs. The current grabbed at her skirts, trying to pull her down, but she fought through it. The boy was going under, his small arms flailing, his mouth open in a silent scream. Maeve reached him just as his head went under again. She grabbed his shirt, hauled him up, and started dragging him toward the bank. The current fought her every inch, and her boots slipped on the rocks beneath the water. Her lungs burned, her arms screamed, but she didn't let go. She got him to the shallow water and dragged him onto the bank, then collapsed beside him, gasping. The boy coughed and vomited water, crying and shaking. Maeve pulled him into her arms, holding him tight. "You're okay," she gasped. "You're okay now." The children swarmed around them, all talking at once, crying and explaining. The boy was Lily's cousin, visiting from town. They'd been playing near the water, and he'd slipped on the rocks. Maeve barely heard them. Her whole body was shaking from cold and adrenaline, her dress plastered to her skin, her hair dripping. But the boy was breathing. That was all that mattered. Coulter appeared, running from the direction of the barn, his face white. "What happened?" "He fell in," Lily sobbed. "Mrs. Boone saved him." Coulter's eyes went to Maeve, then to the child in her arms, then back to Maeve. "You went in after him." "Of course I did." "You could have drowned." "But I didn't." Maeve stood on shaking legs, still holding the boy. "Someone needs to take him home. Tell his parents what happened." "I'll do it." Coulter took the child from her arms, his movements gentle despite the fury in his eyes. "You get inside and get dry before you freeze to death." He rode off with the boy and the other children, and Maeve stood there dripping and shivering, wondering why Coulter had looked so angry. She found out an hour later when he came back. Maeve had changed into dry clothes and was sitting by the stove, trying to warm up, when the door banged open. Coulter stood there, his face dark as a thunderhead. "What were you thinking?" he demanded. Maeve blinked. "What? Jumping into the creek like that? You could have died. A child was drowning." "So you nearly drowned yourself," Coulter's voice was rising now. "That current is dangerous. People die in that water." "But I didn't die. And neither did he. That's not the point." "Then what is the point?" Maeve stood, anger flaring in her chest. "That I should have just stood there and watched a 5-year-old drown? You should have waited for me. There wasn't time to wait. There's always time." "No, there isn't." Maeve's voice cracked. "That's the whole problem, Coulter. You can't control everything. You can't protect everyone. Sometimes things happen fast and you just have to act. Not when it means risking your life. Why do you care?" The question burst out of her before she could stop it. "Why does it matter so much?" Coulter stared at her, his chest heaving, and for a moment she thought he might actually yell, but instead his voice dropped to something raw and broken. "Because I can't lose you." The words hit like a physical blow. "I already lost one person I cared about," Coulter continued, his fists clenched at his sides. "My mother, in that same creek, when I was 10 years old. She went in after a calf that had gotten stuck, and the current took her. I watched her drown and couldn't do anything to stop it." Maeve's anger evaporated. "Coulter. So when I saw you in that water," his voice broke, "when I thought for even a second that I might lose you the same way." He turned away, his shoulders rigid, and Maeve saw him for what he was. Not angry, terrified. She crossed the room and put her hand on his back. "I'm sorry. I didn't know." "How could you? I never told you." He turned to face her, and his eyes were wet. "I don't talk about it, about her, about any of it. But seeing you like that brought it all back, and I—" Maeve pulled him into her arms, and Coulter folded into her like something broken finally allowed to bend. He didn't cry, but she felt him shaking, felt the weight of old grief pouring out of him. "I'm here," she whispered. "I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere." They stood there for a long time, holding each other, and Maeve understood something fundamental about the man she'd married. He wasn't just stoic. He was terrified of loss, of loving something and having it ripped away, just like her. "I can't promise I won't take risks," Maeve said quietly. "I can't promise I'll always be safe, but I can promise I'll try to come back, every single time. Coulter pulled back just enough to look at her, his hands framing her face. That's all I'm asking. And then he kissed her. Really kissed her. Not the careful, tentative presses of lips they'd shared before, but something deep and desperate and real. Maeve gasped against his mouth, her hands fisting in his shirt, and kissed him back with everything she had. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Coulter rested his forehead against hers. I love you, he said roughly. I know I'm not supposed to say it like this, and I know it's too soon, but I love you and I needed you to know. Maeve's eyes stung with tears. It's not too soon. No? No. She kissed him again, softer this time. Because I love you too. The words felt like freedom, like falling and flying at the same time. She'd never said them to anyone before, had never felt them before, but she felt them now, fierce and certain and terrifying in their intensity. Coulter's arms tightened around her. Say it again. I love you. Again. I love you, Coulter Boone. I love this ranch and this life and the man you are when you think no one's watching. Maeve laughed through her tears. I love that you're stubborn and impossible and that you gave me a choice when I had none. I'd give you anything, Coulter said. Everything. If you'd let me. I don't need everything. I just need this. You. He kissed her again, and this time when they pulled apart, Maeve saw her future written in his eyes. Not perfect, not easy, but real and solid and hers. That night they made their marriage real in every way that mattered. Coulter was gentle and patient, taking his time, making sure she felt safe. And Maeve discovered that being wanted, truly wanted, felt like being remade from the inside out. Afterward, lying tangled together in the bed they now shared without hesitation, Coulter traced lazy patterns on her shoulder. I never thought I'd have this, he said quietly. Have what? This feeling, like everything finally makes sense. Maeve smiled against his chest. I know exactly what you mean. They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, and for the first time in her life, Maeve felt completely safe. But safety was a fragile thing. The knock came 3 days later, in the middle of the afternoon. Maeve was kneading bread dough when she heard it, and something in the sharp insistence of it made her stomach drop. She opened the door to find a man in a suit, thin and severe, with papers in his hand. Mrs. Boone? Yes? My name is Harold Gentry. I'm a lawyer from Helena. I represent your brother, Silas Holloway. Maeve's blood turned to ice. What do you want? May I come in? No. Gentry's smile was thin. Very well. I'll be brief. Mr. Holloway is filing a formal complaint with the territorial court. He claims you were coerced into your marriage and are being held against your will. That's a lie. Nevertheless, the court has ordered an investigation. An examiner will be visiting within the week to interview you and your husband separately. If the examiner determines there's merit to the claim, the marriage may be annulled and you'll be remanded to your brother's custody pending further proceedings. The words were a punch to the gut. You can't do that. The court can do whatever it deems necessary to protect a woman's welfare, Mrs. Boone. Gentry's tone was oily, false concern. These are the papers outlining the complaint and the court order. You and your husband are required to cooperate fully. Failure to do so will result in immediate annulment and arrest. He handed her the papers and tipped his hat. Good day, ma'am. We'll be in touch. He left, and Maeve stood there holding the papers, her hand shaking so badly she could barely read them. Coulter found her like that an hour later, still standing in the doorway, the papers crumpled in her fists. What happened? He demanded. Maeve couldn't speak, just handed him the papers. She watched his face as he read, watched the color drain from his skin, watched his jaw clench tighter and tighter until she thought it might break. This is insane, he said finally. They can't actually believe they don't have to believe it. They just have to investigate it. Maeve's voice was hollow. And when they come here and ask me questions, what am I supposed to say? That we started as a business arrangement? That you slept in the barn for weeks? That the marriage was a lie we made true just to keep my brother away? You say the truth, that you chose to stay, that you wanted this. And if they don't believe me? If they think you manipulated me? Maeve's eyes burned. Silas is rich, Coulter. He has connections. He can buy lawyers and judges and anyone else he needs. We're just two people on a ranch in the middle of nowhere. What chance do we have? Coulter grabbed her shoulders, his grip firm. We have the truth. That has to count for something. Truth doesn't always win. Maeve's voice broke. Sometimes the people with power just take what they want, and the rest of us have to live with it. Not this time. Coulter's eyes blazed. I'm not letting him take you. I don't care what it costs. You might not have a choice. There's always a choice. He pulled her close, his voice fierce against her hair. We fight. Together. And we don't stop fighting until we win. Maeve wanted to believe him, wanted to have his certainty, his strength, but she'd seen what happened to people like her when they fought people like Silas. They lost. Every single time, they lost. The week before the examiner arrived felt like waiting for an execution. Maeve moved through the days in a fog of dread, jumping at every sound, watching the road for signs of riders. She couldn't eat, could barely sleep. Even the orchard, her sanctuary, felt tainted now, like Silas's poison had reached even there. Coulter tried to stay calm, tried to project confidence, but she saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand drifted to his gun whenever he heard hoofbeats. They were both waiting for the blow to fall. On the third day, Coulter rode into town to talk to Sheriff Garrett. He came back with a grim expression and news that made Maeve's stomach drop. Garrett says the examiner's name is Whitmore. Federal appointment. Silas probably paid someone to make sure he got assigned. Coulter paced the kitchen like a caged animal. He's known for siding with families over spouses in these cases, claims he's protecting women from predatory men. So he's already decided I need protecting. Maeve's voice was flat. Before he's even met us. We don't know that for sure. Yes, we do. She looked at Coulter, and the fear she'd been holding back finally broke through. This is exactly what Silas does. He buys people, he manipulates systems, and he always wins because people like me don't matter enough to fight for. You matter to me. I know. Maeve's eyes burned. But what if that's not enough? Coulter crossed to her, took her face in his hands. Then we make it enough. We tell our story. We show him this life we've built. We fight with everything we have. And if we lose, his jaw tightened. We won't. But the certainty in his voice sounded hollow, and they both knew it. That night, lying in bed with Coulter's arms around her, Maeve stared at the ceiling and let herself imagine the worst. Being dragged back to the boarding house, being forced to marry Gerald Finch, spending the rest of her life under Silas's control, watching everything she'd built here crumble to dust in her memory. I can't go back, she whispered into the darkness. I'd rather die than go back to that life. Coulter's arms tightened around her. You're not going back. I promise you. You can't promise that. Watch me. The examiner arrived on a Wednesday morning riding in a fancy carriage that looked absurd on the rough Montana roads. Maeve watched from the window as he climbed out, a portly man in his 50s with spectacles and an air of self-importance that made her skin crawl. Coulter met him in the yard, and Maeve could see them talking, see the examiner gesturing with papers, see Coulter's body language going rigid and defensive. Then they both turned toward the house, and her heart hammered against her ribs. Mrs. Boone, Whitmore said when she opened the door, his tone dripping with false kindness. Thank you for seeing me. I know this must be difficult. Maeve said nothing, just stepped aside to let them in. Whitmore settled himself at the table, pulled out a notebook, and smiled at her like she was a child. Now I want you to understand that I'm here to help you. Your brother is very concerned about your welfare, and the court simply wants to ensure you're here of your own free will. I am. Of course. But you understand we need to verify that. These situations can be complicated, especially when a woman has been isolated from her family. His smile widened. So I'll need to interview you and your husband separately, standard procedure. Coulter's hands clenched into fists. That's not necessary. We'll answer any questions together. I'm afraid the court order specifies separate interviews, Mr. Boone. Whitmore's tone turned cold. If you refuse to cooperate, I'll have no choice but to report non-compliance, which would not look favorable in my assessment. The threat hung in the air, clear as day. Fine, Coulter bit out. But I want Sheriff Garrett present. That can be arranged. Whitmore turned his attention to Maeve. Shall we begin with you, Mrs. Boone? Your husband can wait outside. Maeve wanted to scream, wanted to refuse, but she nodded, and Coulter squeezed her shoulder once before walking out, leaving her alone with this man who held her future in his hands. Whitmore pulled out his pen, his expression shifting to something that made her stomach turn, pity mixed with condescension. "Now then, let's start at the beginning. How did you come to be on this ranch?" Maeve told him. About Silas arranging the marriage without her consent, about arriving to find Coulter expecting someone else, about the choice he'd given her to stay or leave. Whitmore's pen scratched across the paper. "And you chose to stay with a complete stranger rather than return to your family. Why?" "Because my family wasn't safe. My brother treated me like property. He stole my wages and made me work without rest. When a man tried to assault me and I defended myself, Silas shipped me west like I was something to be thrown away. Your brother tells a different story. He says you were unstable, violent, that he arranged this marriage as an act of kindness, to give you a fresh start." "He's lying." "Is he?" Whitmore leaned forward. "Mrs. Boone, I've reviewed the documents. Your brother has statements from multiple witnesses describing erratic behavior, including a sworn affidavit from a Mr. Gerald Finch, stating you physically attacked him without provocation." "That's not what happened. He cornered me in an alley. He tried to—" Maeve's voice cracked. "I was defending myself. Mr. Finch claims otherwise, and you have no witnesses to support your version of events." Whitmore's expression was almost sympathetic. "I understand you may feel grateful to Mr. Boone for providing you shelter, but gratitude can sometimes be confused with genuine affection, especially for a woman in a vulnerable position." "I'm not confused." "Tell me, Mrs. Boone, did Mr. Boone ever threaten you, suggest that you had nowhere else to go, make you feel that refusing him would leave you destitute?" "No. He gave me a choice, a real choice. But you were already on his ranch, miles from town, with no money and no means of leaving. Is that really a choice?" Whitmore's pen kept moving. "And the marriage itself, how long after your arrival did it take place?" Maeve's throat tightened. "A few weeks?" "A few weeks, with a man you'd just met, who you were living with, alone, unchaperoned." Whitmore's eyebrows rose. "Surely you can see how that appears improper, how it suggests coercion." "It wasn't coercion. I wanted to marry him." "Did you? Or did you feel you had no other option?" Whitmore set down his pen, folding his hands. "Mrs. Boone, I've seen cases like this before. Women who convince themselves they're happy because the alternative is too painful to consider. It's a form of survival, and there's no shame in admitting it." "I'm not convincing myself of anything." Maeve's voice rose. "I love my husband. I chose this life, and I'm not leaving. Love." Whitmore's tone was gentle, pitying. "Mrs. Boone, can you honestly say you would have chosen this life, this isolated ranch, this hard labor, if you'd had true freedom to choose? If your brother hadn't forced the situation?" The question hit like a knife between the ribs, because the truth was complicated. She hadn't chosen to come here. She'd been sent. And at first she'd stayed because she had nowhere else to go. But that wasn't the whole truth. Not anymore. "I wouldn't have chosen to come here," Maeve said slowly, "but I chose to stay. And I keep choosing it, every single day. That's what freedom means, not the circumstances that brought you somewhere, but the decision to remain." Whitmore studied her for a long moment, and Maeve couldn't read his expression. Then he stood, gathering his papers. "Thank you for your time, Mrs. Boone. I'll need to speak with your husband now, alone." Maeve wanted to protest, but she knew it would only make things worse. She walked outside on shaking legs and found Coulter waiting by the barn, pacing like a penned bull. "How bad?" he asked immediately. "Bad." Maeve's voice trembled. "He thinks you coerced me, that I'm suffering from some kind of, I don't know, delusion brought on by desperation." Coulter's face went dark. "That's insane. It's what Silas wants him to think. And he's good at his job, Coulter. He knows exactly how to twist everything to fit the story he wants to tell." "Then I'll tell him the truth." "The truth doesn't matter if he's already decided what it is." Coulter pulled her close, his voice fierce against her hair. "It matters. It has to matter." Sheriff Garrett arrived then, dismounting from his horse with a grim expression. "Boone, Mrs. Boone, hell of a situation you've got here." "Can you help us?" Maeve asked desperately. I can tell the truth about what I've seen. You two seem happy enough to me, but Whitmore's got a reputation for ignoring local testimony in favor of family claims. Garrett sighed. I'll do what I can, but you should prepare for the worst. Coulter went inside and Maeve stood in the yard with the sheriff, her whole body shaking. What happens if Whitmore rules against us? Your marriage gets annulled. You go back to your brother's custody until the court determines otherwise. Garrett's voice was kind but honest. And given his money and connections, that could be a very long time. So I lose everything. Maybe not. You could appeal, fight it in a higher court. With what money? What resources? Maeve laughed bitterly. Silas has both. We have nothing but the truth, and apparently that's not enough. The truth is always enough, Mrs. Boone. Sometimes it just takes longer to be heard. But Maeve didn't have longer. She had now, this moment, this fragile life she'd built that was about to be ripped away. Coulter's interview lasted over an hour. When he finally emerged, his face was pale, his jaw tight enough to crack teeth. Whitmore followed, tucking his notebook into his coat. Thank you both for your cooperation, Whitmore said with that same false smile. I'll be submitting my report to the territorial court within 3 days. You'll be notified of the ruling by post. And until then, Coulter's voice was hard. Until then, Mrs. Boone may remain here, provided she does so willingly and without restriction. I'll be checking back in 2 days to ensure compliance. Whitmore climbed back into his carriage. Good day. They watched him leave, dust rising in his wake, and the silence that fell was suffocating. What did he ask you? Maeve finally said. Everything. Coulter's voice was hollow. About how we met, how quickly we married, whether I'd threatened you or isolated you, whether our marriage had been... He stopped, his face flushing. Consummated. Maeve's cheeks burned. What did you tell him? The truth. That we married for protection. That I slept in the barn for weeks. That it took time for us to become what we are now. Coulter turned to look at her, and his eyes were haunted. I think I made it worse. Everything I said just confirmed his suspicions that you were coerced. We can't win this. The realization settled over Maeve like a shroud. No matter what we say, no matter what the truth is, Silas has already won. No, Coulter's voice was sharp. I'm not accepting that. What choice do we have? We run. The words hung in the air, shocking in their simplicity. Maeve stared at him. What? We leave, tonight, before Whitmore comes back. Coulter grabbed her shoulders, his eyes blazing. We go north, across the border into Canada. Start over somewhere Silas can't reach us. That's insane. We'd be fugitives. We'd be together and free. For how long? They'd hunt us. Find us eventually, and then it would be even worse. You'd be arrested for kidnapping, and I'd still end up back with Silas. Maeve shook her head. We can't run from this. Then what do we do? Coulter's voice cracked. Just wait for them to tear you away from me? Watch them destroy everything we've built? I don't know. Maeve's eyes burned with tears she refused to shed. But running isn't the answer. That night they lay awake, both pretending to sleep, the weight of the unknown crushing them. Maeve kept thinking about Whitmore's questions, about how the truth could be twisted into something ugly, about how everything she'd become here could be erased by a single report. Tell me something, she whispered into the darkness. Anything. If we lose this, if they take me away, will you wait for me? Coulter's arms tightened around her. There's nothing to wait for, because we're not losing. But if we do, we won't. His voice was fierce. I won't let it happen. I'll find a way, Maeve. I swear to you, I'll find a way. But wanting something didn't make it true, and promises didn't change reality. The next morning, Maeve was feeding the chickens when she heard riders approaching. Her heart seized, thinking it was Whitmore come early. But when she looked up, she saw Sheriff Garrett and another man, older, distinguished, wearing the black robes of a judge. Coulter emerged from the barn, his hand dropping to his gun. What's this? Easy, Boone, so Garrett dismounted. This is Judge Thornton from Helena. He wants to talk to you both. The court already sent an examiner, Coulter said. We've cooperated. I'm not here in an official capacity. Thornton's voice was deep and measured. May we speak inside? They gathered in the small house, the space feeling even smaller with 4 people crowded around the table. Judge Thornton settled into a chair, his eyes moving between Maeve and Coulter with an assessing gaze. "I'll be direct," Thornton said. "I've been reviewing the complaint filed by Silas Holloway, and I have concerns about the examiner assigned to this case." Maeve's breath caught. What kind of concerns? Examiner Whitmore has a history of bias in these matters. He believes strongly that women need male family protection and tends to side with brothers, fathers, and uncles over husbands, especially in cases involving mail-order marriages. Thornton leaned back. "I've also received information suggesting Mr. Holloway may have offered Whitmore financial incentive to rule in his favor." "He bribed him," Coulter said flatly. "I have no proof, but I have suspicions." Thornton pulled out papers of his own, "Which is why I'm here. I want to conduct my own assessment before Whitmore submits his report." Hope flickered in Maeve's chest, dangerous and fragile. "Why would you do that?" "Because I don't like corruption in my jurisdiction, and because Sheriff Garrett has given me his assessment of your situation, which differs significantly from what the complaint suggests." Thornton looked at Maeve. "Tell me, Mrs. Boone, in your own words, do you want to be here?" It was the same question Whitmore had asked, but somehow, from this man, it felt different, like he actually wanted to hear the answer. Maeve took a breath. "When I first came here, I didn't want anything. I was numb, broken. I'd spent my whole life being told I was worthless, that I was a burden, that no one would ever want me, and when my brother shipped me west, I believed I was being thrown away like trash." She looked at Coulter, at the man who'd changed everything without meaning to. "But Coulter didn't treat me like trash. He gave me a choice. The first real choice anyone had ever given me. And when I chose to stay, he gave me space to figure out who I was without someone telling me. He let me work, let me fail, let me become something other than what I'd been." Her voice grew stronger, steadier. "I'm not here because I'm desperate or confused or coerced. I'm here because this place made me remember what it feels like to be human, to have value, to be wanted not for what I can do for someone else, but for who I am." Maeve's eyes stung. "My brother wants me back because he can't stand the idea of me being free. Because if I'm free, it means he was wrong about me, and he can't accept that." Thornton was silent for a long moment. Then he turned to Coulter. "And you, Mr. Boone? What's your stake in this?" "I love her." Coulter's voice was rough but certain. "I married her to protect her, but I love her because of who she is, and I'll spend the rest of my life proving she was worth choosing." Thornton studied them both, his expression unreadable. Then he pulled out a document and set it on the table. "This is an emergency injunction. It temporarily suspends Examiner Whitmore's authority, in this case, pending an investigation into his conduct. It also places Mrs. Boone under the court's protection rather than her brother's guardianship while the matter is reviewed." Thornton looked at Maeve. "But I need you to understand something. This is temporary. The case will still go before the territorial court, and you'll need to testify, publicly, against your brother." Maeve's hands trembled. "Will it be enough? My word against his?" "Not alone. But Sheriff Garrett's testimony will help, as will testimony from others who've witnessed your life here." Thornton gestured to the window, toward the orchard. "And if you can show that you've built something, contributed to this community, it makes a stronger case that you're here by choice." "The children," Coulter said suddenly. "The Fletcher kids and their family. They come here all the time. They've seen how Maeve is with them, how she saved that boy from drowning. Get them to testify. Get anyone who's seen you two together to testify." Thornton stood. "I can't promise you'll win, but I can promise you'll get a fair hearing, which is more than Whitmore would have given you." After the judge and sheriff left, Maeve collapsed into a chair, her whole body shaking with relief and residual fear. "We have a chance," Coulter said. "A real chance. It's not over yet. But it's not over." He pulled her to her feet, his hands framing her face. "We're still fighting, and as long as we're fighting, we haven't lost." The next 2 weeks were a blur of preparation. Sheriff Garrett helped them gather witnesses. The Fletcher family agreed to testify, as did several other neighbors who'd seen Maeve in town, watched her transform from the frightened woman who'd arrived in spring to the fierce one who'd saved a child's life. Mrs. Chen, the seamstress, even agreed to speak about the dresses Coulter had commissioned. Proof, she said, that a man who cared enough to provide for his wife that way wasn't a kidnapper. And through it all, Maeve worked the orchard. Because whatever happened, whatever the court decided, she needed to know she'd finished what she started, that she'd taken something broken and made it bloom. The day of the hearing arrived in late July, hot and bright and terrifying. The courtroom in Helena was packed. Maeve sat beside Coulter at the front, her hands clenched in her lap, watching as Silas and his lawyer took their seats across the aisle. Her brother's eyes met hers, cold and triumphant, and she felt the old fear try to crawl back into her bones. But Coulter's hand found hers under the table, and she held on tight. Judge Thornton presided, his expression grave. This is a hearing to determine the validity of the marriage between Coulter Boone and Maeve Holloway Boone, and to assess the complaint of coercion filed by Silas Holloway. We'll hear testimony from both parties and any relevant witnesses. Mr. Gentry, you may begin. Silas's lawyer stood, smooth and confident. He painted a picture of a desperate, mentally unstable woman manipulated by an opportunistic rancher. He presented Gerald Finch's testimony about the unprovoked attack. He brought up Maeve's weight, her lack of prospects, her vulnerability, all framed as reasons she would be easily controlled. Maeve sat there listening to herself be dissected, reduced to nothing but her worst moments and biggest insecurities. It took everything she had not to run from the room. Then it was their turn. Sheriff Garrett testified about the confrontation at the ranch, about how Coulter had stood up to armed men to protect Maeve, about how the marriage certificate was legally filed and valid, about how every interaction he'd witnessed showed two people choosing each other. The Fletcher family testified about Maeve's kindness, her bravery, how she'd risked her life to save their nephew, how the children loved her, trusted her, sought her out. Mrs. Chen testified about the dresses, about how Coulter had come to her specifically asking for things that would make Maeve feel beautiful and valued. And then Maeve testified. She stood before the court, her voice shaking at first but growing stronger with every word. She told them everything: the boarding house, the mockery, Silas's cruelty, Gerald's assault, being shipped west like cargo. And then she told them about the choice Coulter had given her, about the orchard, about learning what it felt like to be free. My brother says I'm confused, she said, looking directly at Silas, that I'm grateful and mistaking it for love. But he's wrong. I know the difference between gratitude and love, between survival and living. And for the first time in my life, I'm doing both. She turned to the judge. I'm not asking you to protect me from my husband. I'm asking you to protect me from the man who spent years convincing me I was worthless. Because that's the real coercion. Spending your whole life being told you're nothing until you believe it. The courtroom was silent when she sat down. Finally, Coulter took the stand. He spoke simply, honestly, about how he'd expected one woman and gotten another. About how he'd been angry at first, disappointed, until he'd watched Maeve work and realized she was stronger than anyone he'd ever met. I didn't marry her because I felt sorry for her, he said. I married her because I couldn't imagine my life without her in it, and every day since she's proven I was right to choose her. He looked at Maeve, his eyes holding hers. She's not damaged goods. She's not a burden. She's the best thing that ever happened to me, and if this court takes her away, it won't be protecting her. It'll be punishing her for having the courage to choose her own life. Judge Thornton called for a recess. The wait was agony. 2 hours that felt like years. Maeve sat in the hallway with Coulter, neither of them speaking, both holding on to each other like they were drowning. When they were finally called back in, Thornton's expression was unreadable. I've reviewed all testimony and evidence, he began, and I find that while Mrs. Boone's initial arrival at the Boone Ranch was arranged without her full consent, her decision to remain and marry was made freely. The evidence shows a woman who has found independence and purpose, not one being controlled. Maeve's heart hammered so hard she thought it might explode. Furthermore, I find the complaint filed by Mr. Holloway to be without merit and motivated by personal grievance rather than genuine concern for his sister's welfare. The marriage between Coulter Boone and Maeve Boone is hereby affirmed as legal and valid. Thornton's gaze moved to Silas. Mr. Holloway, you are permanently barred from contacting Mrs. Boone or entering her property. Any violation will result in immediate arrest. The gavel came down, and Maeve couldn't breathe. They'd won. Silas stood, his face purple with rage, shouting something about appeals and corruption, but his lawyer was already pulling him toward the door. Maeve watched him go, watched the man who'd controlled her entire life disappear into the crowd, powerless to hurt her anymore. And then Coulter was pulling her to her feet, his arms around her, his face buried in her hair. "It's over," he said roughly. "It's really over." Maeve clung to him, tears streaming down her face, and felt something inside her finally, truly break open. Not break apart. Break open, like a seed splitting to let the plant through. They rode back to the ranch in silence, but it was a different silence than before. Peaceful. Settled. The kind of quiet that came after a storm when everything was finally, blessedly still. When they arrived home, Maeve walked straight to the orchard. The trees were heavy with young fruit now, green apples swelling on every branch. By fall, they'd be ready to harvest. By next spring, there'd be blossoms again. Everything came back if you gave it time and care. Everything could bloom again. Coulter found her there, standing beneath the trees in the golden evening light. "You all right?" he asked. "Yeah." Maeve turned to him, and for the first time in her life, she felt the word was actually true. "I'm all right." "Good, because I have something to ask you." "What?" Coulter reached into his pocket and pulled out a ring, simple, silver, with a small stone that caught the light. "I know we're already married, but I want to do it right this time. No contracts, no lawyers, no one forcing anything." He dropped to one knee right there in the dirt. "Maeve Boone, will you marry me? Again? For real this time?" Maeve laughed through fresh tears. "We're already married." "I know, but I want you to choose it. Choose me. Not because you have to, but because you want to." She looked at this man who'd given her everything without asking for anything in return, who'd fought for her when she couldn't fight for herself, who'd loved her not despite her past, but because of what she'd become. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you, again and again, and as many times as you ask." Coulter stood and slipped the ring onto her finger, and they kissed there among the apple trees while the sun set and the land stretched out forever around them. 3 months later, the orchard produced its first real harvest. Not much. A few bushels of apples, tart and imperfect, but undeniably real. Maeve made pies and sold them in town, and people said they'd never tasted anything better. The Fletcher children became regular fixtures at the ranch, climbing trees and helping with chores and filling the space with laughter. Maeve taught Lily how to prune branches, Tom how to check fruit for ripeness, James how to read the weather in the sky. She and Coulter talked about building onto the house, about maybe having children of their own someday, about all the futures that were suddenly impossibly available to them. One evening in late October, they sat on the porch watching the first snowfall, wrapped in blankets, Coulter's arm around her shoulders. "You ever regret it?" Maeve asked quietly. "Marrying the wrong woman?" "I didn't marry the wrong woman," Coulter's voice was certain. "I married exactly who I was meant to marry. Just took me a while to realize it." Maeve leaned into him, watching the snow dust the orchard, the white softening everything. She thought about the girl she'd been, scared, broken, convinced she was unwanted. And she thought about the woman she'd become, strong, free, beloved. Not because someone had rescued her, but because someone had given her the space to rescue herself. That was the truth no one talked about. That being saved wasn't about someone swooping in and fixing you. It was about someone believing you were worth saving until you believed it too, and then stepping back and letting you do the work yourself. Coulter had given her that. And she'd given him something too, proof that love wasn't about finding someone perfect, but about finding someone who made you want to be better than you were. "Tell me something," Coulter said after a while. "Anything. Are you happy?" Maeve thought about the orchard and the children and the life they were building, about the hard work and the quiet moments and the way Coulter looked at her every morning like she was something miraculous, about how she'd gone from being the woman nobody wanted to, being the woman who'd changed everything, the land, the man, her own fate. "Yeah," she said softly. "I'm happy." And she was. Not because everything was perfect. It wasn't. There were still hard days and old scars and moments when the past tried to claw its way back. But she'd learned something crucial in the months since arriving at this ranch. Freedom wasn't about erasing your scars.